This is Green Street, the Environmental Health Show, greenstreetnews.org, Patti and Doug Wood, and our worldwide network of scientists, medical professionals, and other experts here with us every week to talk about things that are going on in the world that you need to know so you can protect yourself and your family in this increasingly toxic world. Welcome back. Recently, the President issued an executive order that invoked the Defense Production Act to require U.S. manufacturers to make more of a chemical pesticide called glyphosate, the most popular pesticide in the history of the world, which has been linked to serious health problems ranging from cancer to endocrine disruption. On our show today, we'll talk about glyphosate and other toxins that are regularly used in the production of food in our country. So stay tuned for that, coming up in a few minutes after we take a look at some of the news of the week. Patti, what do you got for us this week?
Well, there's a new study that shows that the synergistic effects of combining wireless radiation or radio frequency radiation.
That's radiation from cell phones.
That's
and
correct.
routers
Everything
and,
wireless,
okay.
The whole wireless world.
Yeah.
That exposure with hexavalent chromium, the industrial contaminant that was made famous in the Aaron Brockovich movie.
I was going to say, that's,
right.
Yeah, sure.
Right. That it significantly increased DNA damage.
The combination of those two things.
The combination increased DNA damage.
Okay.
In the study, embryonic cells from mice were exposed to hexavalent chromium for 12 hours, followed by 15 minutes of wireless radiation exposure to test for a synergistic effect. Cells which were exposed only to the 15 minutes of wireless radiation showed no effect, but those cells exposed to both the radiation and the hexavalent chromium led to increased genotoxicity, including double-strand DNA breaks that can lead to mutations, chromosomal instability, and cancer if not properly repaired.
Holy cow.
Yeah. As is the case with many chemicals in a phenomenon first observed by Rachel Carson, their combined synergistic effects can be toxic, even if their individual effects are not.
Yeah, we never test things in combination. We test
Well, there's so
individual-
many. How many combinations are there out there?
I understand, but you know
yeah.
what? Just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Well, the authors of the study conclude that combined exposure of RF radiation, the kind emitted by all cell phones, routers, smart utility meters, and other wireless devices with the hexavalent chromium could lead to significant human health problems. In our modern world, people are simultaneously exposed to multiple environmental hazards, from air pollution to heavy metals and industrial chemicals, as well as almost constant exposure to wireless radiation from nearby cell towers. This study adds to a growing body of evidence that non-ionizing electromagnetic fields can act synergistically with other toxics, heightening their harmful effects.
We always knew there was a problem with the wireless radiation, and we've known,
This is a whole new area of study, though, with
no
this,
kidding.
I think, it's going to be a big deal.
The synergistic effects.
Yeah. This new science supports calls for caution regarding the exposure to wireless radiation, particularly for pregnant women and young children. So where do you get exposed to hexavalent chromium? So
I don't know. I was going to ask you that.
It's in leather products. It's in dyes that are used pretty widely, for all kinds of things that people buy. And CCA, which is chromated copper arsenate, which is something that is used in pressure-treated wood. So they use it for playgrounds and for decks and for all kinds of things to just make sure that it lasts longer in the environment. It doesn't rot as quickly.
Yeah. All right. What else you got?
Well, more than 70% of American adults are very or somewhat concerned about exposure to toxic chemicals in their food and drinking water, according to a new survey by the Pew Charitable Trusts.
Thanks to our show, I'm afraid.
Public concern is so intense that 5 out of 6 adults in the United States said that they wanted the federal government and industry to do more to protect them.
You think?
Yeah. So up to 84% of the more than 5,000 adults in their survey said that the federal government, quote, needs to do more to identify and regulate harmful chemicals found in everyday products.
I'm really glad to hear that so many people are concerned about this.
Yeah, so a similar percentage of survey respondents also wanted more transparency from manufacturers about the chemicals in the products that they make.
Yeah, forget that.
And if cleanup of chemical pollution was needed, 77% of respondents wanted industry to pay for it.
Well, that's just common sense, I think, isn't it?
In addition to worry over exposure to toxins in food and drinking water, more than 60% of American adults are also very or somewhat concerned about chemicals that industry uses in children's toys, baby products, food packaging, personal care products such as makeup, and these are all things that the Pew survey
I'm
also
telling you,
found.
I'm telling you this because more people are listening to our show every week. I think that's the reason.
All right, there are more than 350,000 chemicals in commerce and at least 15,159, get that number, 15,159 chemicals just in food contact materials.
You're going to test me later on this?
Yep, most of which lack any risk assessments. So it's clear the current regulatory approach has failed. The survey also found 83% of American adults strongly or somewhat strongly believe companies that make chemicals found in everyday products cannot be trusted to ensure product safety without government oversight.
Yeah.
But the American Chemistry Council that runs this whole operation
Everything
and
is just
represents
fine, right?
all chemical manufacturers said, quote, our members undertake extensive scientific analysis to evaluate potential risks of their chemicals from development through use and safe disposal. We work with regulators, retailers, and manufacturers to provide them with information about our chemicals, end quote.
Yeah, but not all the information.
So concern over the risks of flame retardants, bisphenols, phthalates, PFAS, it just goes on and on and on. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of chemicals, and people really care about this. We're talking about cancer, fertility issues, reproductive problems.
I'm telling you, Patty.
High cholesterol, hormone disruption, liver damage, obesity, thyroid disease, and it goes on and on and on.
You watch television, and it's either an ad for a drug company or it's a fundraiser for children's cancer.
I know,
it's either one or the other. And nobody's putting these two things together. We advertise all these products that are filled with chemicals. Then we see all these people getting sick, and so we have all these medications, to take care of these people who are all getting sick. And then for the little ones, we build new hospitals. That's our solution.
Well, it's always the same question. Do we protect human health, or do we protect
profits?
The bottom line for manufacturers?
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Patty.
You're welcome. Every day, for most of us 3 or more times a day, we eat. Some of us spend a lot of time preparing our food, and some of us just grab what we can. Some of us search out organic ingredients, and some of us are focused more on calories or cost. But how many of us really know where our food is coming from, and what chemicals have been used to produce it? When we recently heard that the president had ordered increased production of a toxic pesticide called glyphosate, more commonly known by its trade name RoundUp, we knew who to call.
Jay Feldman is executive director of the nonprofit organization Beyond Pesticides, which has a mission to protect healthy air, water, land, and food for ourselves and future generations. Jay, Patty, and I have been friends for many years, and we're delighted to welcome Jay back to the show. We started our conversation talking about the new executive order on the pesticide glyphosate. Here's our conversation with Jay Feldman.
Glyphosate epitomizes what's wrong with our dependency on toxic chemicals for managing air, land, water, and food. And glyphosate really is the poster child for the problems associated with the use of toxic chemicals. It was brought on the market in the 70s, mid-70s, and viewed as a miracle product, that it was very safe, you could drink it, all that. And we did see some information on the carcinogenicity, and EPA was concerned about the chemical being carcinogen. And when it put out public comment period, Monsanto convinced the agency that it was not a carcinogen. And then 3 decades later, the International Agency for Research on Cancer found that it was probably a human carcinogen, and it has since been associated with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And there have been numerous lawsuits amounting to about $10.8 billion in settlements and jury verdicts against Monsanto Bayer for exposure to the chemical. The other element here is that it is integral to a food production system that's highly dependent on genetically engineered organisms. And glyphosate was engineered in a way that the plants have been engineered, or the crops, in a way that is tolerant to the chemical. Glyphosate's the whole package. We know it's a carcinogen. It's an endocrine disruptor, meaning it attacks the endocrine system, which is the management system of our body. It's a central message system. And it defies classical toxicology in the sense that we think about dose makes the poison typically when we think about toxic chemicals, but glyphosate glyphosate really is central to the conversation around the inverse dose response curve, meaning that it's not the dose that makes it poison, it's the timing of exposure at minute doses during critical windows of vulnerability. And that really turns toxicology on its head and is really problematic from a regulatory standpoint because the agency is not set up really to evaluate these endocrine disruptors.
Well, if the EPA is not going to do it, who's supposed to be testing for these endocrine disruptors?
Ironically, Congress is way ahead or was way ahead of the agency EPA. Back in 96, it mandated that EPA should come up with a protocol for evaluating endocrine disrupting pesticides, and it has never completed that process.
Okay.
So to this day, one of the most important adverse health effects outcome, which is endocrine disruption, that is linked to all kinds of other diseases. It's linked to obesity, diabetes. It's linked to epigenetic effects, meaning it can affect DNA, not as a genetic issue that's inherited, but an inheritable adverse effect that's carried over generations, caused by not your own inherited genetic makeup, but by an environmental insult. And so we see these problems over time and over generations. We get hung up and, I understand why communities see the news and zero in on glyphosate, RoundUp, want to spend their efforts banning the chemical. And it makes a lot of sense. But really, we need to start looking at glyphosate and other chemicals that we hear about in the news, dicamba, chlorpyrifos. These are chemicals that make the headlines. They're really symptomatic of a failed regulatory system that has allowed our land management across food and non-food, dietary, non-dietary exposure, water, food, air, land to be contaminated. And we as an organization have been linking that dependency to this intersection because we're talking about petrochemicals, right? Yeah. These are fossil fuel-based chemicals. Yeah. That intersection between fossil fuel-based endocrine disrupting chemicals and adverse health effects, dramatic adverse health effects, and the other critical issues that have been identified by the UN and internationally, is biodiversity decline or biodiversity collapse, as it's known, and the climate crisis.
Jay, talk a little bit about biodiversity collapse. I hadn't heard that phrase before.
Well, you've heard the phrase, but yeah.
Well, you've heard it in terms of the insect apocalypse, right?
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, the New York Times Magazine had a cover story on the insect apocalypse, and relying on some research that had come out of Germany and other places where they documented these tremendous declines over the last several decades, 70% or more decline in insect population.
I just think I remember that article. It was so fascinating because they were just actually using windshields on cars as places to collect and see the numbers of insects in the environment. So
exactly. Yeah. And then, when I was growing up, when I was in college, I used to drive through the Midwest and you'd have to stop literally and clean your windshield off of the insect. And that study was fascinating. I think it really did open people's eyes to the fact that we have lost these insects. But what does that mean? That has dramatic trophic effects, right, through the chain of insects. So the dependency birds have on insect populations. They're predator insects that rely on the food source of insect. Bats, we mention all the time because bats serve an important role in terms of pollination and also insect consumption. So we lose this balance, we lose the biodiversity. And biodiversity, we tend to think about, we see the big animals, that are on the logos of some environmental organizations, whether it's elephants or it's a panda bear or whatever. But these endangered species that are threatened or practically extinct really are symptomatic of the loss of thousands of species that we're experiencing over time as a result of our, I think, failure of policy to protect this incredible asset of biodiversity. Now, at our peril, we ignore biodiversity as sort of an issue that's over here on the side, and then there's health over here, and then there's maybe climate. And we don't really appreciate as a matter of public health and well-being the importance of insects to our own survivability, right? We need a healthy ecosystem as human beings. All organisms need a healthy ecosystem to survive.
Yeah. This is all so fascinating.
Yeah, it's great.
But, I would love for you to talk about how glyphosate or Roundup Ready crops are impacting our food system and thereby our health.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you create an agricultural system that's dependent on an input like a fossil fuel-based material, you're immediately accepting a hazard. So there's the chemical itself. In an agricultural system that's dependent on genetically engineered crops and Roundup Ready crops, meaning these are crops that are tolerant of a weed killer that's being used to control weed populations. Why do we control weed populations? Because they're considered to be an economic threat to the crop. And they're competing with the crop. So in a sense, you're saying that as a farmer, you're going to buy into a whole package now of agriculture. You're going to buy into a package of agriculture that starts with the seed. The seed produces the plant. The plant is tolerant of the herbicide. You plant that seed, you use that herbicide. You have now committed yourself to a soil fertility program that's highly dependent on fossil fuel-based synthetic fertilizers because you're spraying crops with a toxic chemical that adversely affects soil health, microbial life in the soil. You cannot produce or cycle nutrients naturally, nitrogen, and so you are going to buy your nitrogen in a bag. And then, you are killing off insect populations that are also protective of your crop or enhance productivity. Pollinators in your field, whether you're a pollinated crop or not, has a tremendous impact on crop productivity, which is something that we often forget. You're going to get better productivity out of a crop when you have pollinators in the field foraging. And so the system of a genetically engineered plant being highly dependent on toxic chemicals has an adverse effect on the whole ecosystem in which those plants are grown, the waterways near those plants, the diversity, the biodiversity around those fields, and the communities living nearby because of chemical drift off of those fields into communities. And even onto neighboring fields.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, what happens when a sprayed chemical, drifts onto other people's land?
It's a fascinating history because when glyphosate drifts, when it's used, it's often applied by airplane, aerial application, drifting onto neighboring fields. If you don't have a Roundup Ready crop in that neighboring field, you're going to suffer crop damage, plant damage. It's going to adversely affect your productivity. And Monsanto at the time, and now Bayer, their solution to the problem is, well, you should just plant Roundup Ready crops. That'll protect you from the drift. Again, the last point on this is that once you commit to this genetically engineered crop and the whole cropping system and chemical dependency, you have now reduced the ability of your farm, of your land, to sequester atmospheric carbon and draw down the carbon contributing to greenhouse gases. And so you are no longer contributing to a solution. You are part of the problem, unfortunately. Do I blame farmers for this? No. I mean, this is the system that is being promoted and supported through our U.S. Department of Agriculture, through our land grant institutions. The advice that farmers get all go in this direction, while we have a solution that is not dependent on these chemicals, which namely is organic agriculture, which is a $70 billion sector of agriculture, and yet is not seen at this point yet to be the solution that we need, although it is the solution that we need.
I was just going to say it is, but it is the solution. Yeah.
Right.
We have an organic farmer in our family. They moved from the
Right.
end of Long Island to 120 acres up in Springfield, Vermont, right on the Connecticut River. And what did they do before they bought that land? They tested the soil. It was just
Yeah.
all about the soil.
Jay, I want to go back for a second and talk about this executive order that President Trump has put out there using the Defense Production Act to increase the production of glyphosate. That sounds crazy to me. From your perspective, what do you think is really going on here?
We have an administration that's created a trade crisis, manufactured by the White House.
Absolutely.
And then they turn around and say, we're going to lose access to glyphosate because a lot of glyphosate comes out of China. And China is not exporting as much of their product to the U.S.
Right, because we put these tariffs on.
Exactly. Because we've destroyed relationships, we've created these tariffs, artificial inflating the cost of these things. But there is a provision in the Defense Production Act, which once invoked, releases the manufacturer of that product from any liability.
That's the big number here.
Exactly.
From my perspective.
Exactly.
Yep.
And that's the bottom line for this company. They have been in litigation, and as the chemical industry has been in litigation for years, trying to get out from under the liability issue. And I always go back to the original Supreme Court decision on this question of liability, because it really captured the decision this was 2005, Bates v. Dow. And I just want to read to you the finding of this court. The long history, this is a quote, the long history of tort litigation against manufacturers of poisonous substances adds force to the presumption against preemption, for Congress surely would have expressed its intention more clearly if it had meant to deprive injured parties of a long available form of compensation.
Yep.
And then to top it off, and this is key, we operate in the United States with our capitalist system. We operate with incentives and disincentives. So the market really is driven by incentives and disincentives. Some of that is consumer demand, right? There's an incentive now more and more for people to demand green products. I mean, the industry is incentivized by that demand to produce products that are more friendly to the environment. And that, I think, is born out of the work of groups that are constantly educating people on the hazards of these pesticides, the availability of alternatives, the impact on future generations, et cetera. And so the market often shifts to meet that demand. The same thing's true with liability, right? If the manufacturers think, hey, we could get sued, there's an incentive for them to then produce safer materials. So that's the whole package. And that's what we're fighting now in the Farm Bill. The overreach, the wish list, if you can imagine something the industry would like to have to protect them from any responsibility and accountability, liability, and basic decency in terms of protecting the well-being of life. And I'm talking life across all organisms on the planet. It is in this Farm Bill. An arrogant chemical industry that is just...
It's all about money, Jay. It's all about money.
Yeah.
Just think of people who come from, economic circumstances that don't allow them to buy organic foods, and they buy a lot of processed foods and ultra processed foods.
Yes.
And most of those foods are using crops like corn and soybean and wheat and so on that are all GMO crops. And so not only are being exposed to all of the chemicals that are involved in the whole processing itself, right?
Yes.
Taking everything out of these foods that had anything nutritious in them, and then also exposing them to chemical pesticides. I mean, how much of the American food supply is contaminated with pesticides?
Well, all of the food supply is contaminated. What this all comes down to, unfortunately, is the definition of contamination.
Yeah, exactly.
This all comes down to the definition of contamination. And we have a situation in which the legal limits of pesticides in our food supply exceeds what the scientific literature, I'm talking about the independent scientific literature, tells us are safe levels
Right,
of
of
chemicals
course,
in our
and
food.
especially endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Exactly. I
Where
was
the
just going to
dose
say.
doesn't make the poison. The poison is
Exactly.
sometimes more harmful in minute amounts.
Yeah. So a lot of the problems we're talking about have existed for a while. I mean, we
Yeah,
can go
yep,
back
yep,
and cite GAO reports, General Accounting Office reports,
right.
Office of Inspector General reports, the National Academy of Sciences. The deficiencies in the regulatory process are not new. They're just being institutionalized in a way in this farm bill that sets in cement some of these deficiencies that we've been working to improve over the years. I mean, we have a situation here in which we don't test fully for the kinds of health outcomes that we need to test for, endocrine disruption being at the top of the list, and adverse effects that are directly tied to endocrine disruption.
Right. I know that you're focused on pesticides, but endocrine disruptors are just plastics.
Plastics,
Plastics are
right?
loaded with endocrine
Right.
disruptors.
PFAS.
PFAS. Yep.
It's throughout our modern age and the integration in our system. We've covered stories that shows elevated toxicity when we combine plastic and pesticides. We've basically been able to show that there's leaching. The scientific community has shown leaching out of plastics into pesticides. And so we have a whole set of chemicals that are defined as PFAS in the scientific literature, but not by EPA. So they get defined out and are not adequately regulated. So we do have, as you're saying, there are mixtures of chemicals in the environment that cause additional impacts. And those are not studied. We've been covering a number of studies that show synergistic effects of pesticides, meaning the mixture of two pesticides cause an elevated effect that aren't seen when looking at the two chemicals or three chemicals in that mixture individually. And so we don't have a protocol, let alone for testing mixtures of pharmaceuticals and pesticides or plastics and pesticides. We don't even have a protocol for testing the mixtures of pesticides in our daily diet. We saw a big problem a couple of years ago with the dog collars, in which the dog collars had a mixture of chemicals that were causing the problem. And the EPA never studied that mixture, and dogs were dying as a result of that exposure. So these are long-standing problems that really need to be corrected. We spend a lot of time following the science. We comment on these during these public comment periods. And I'll tell you, my position on this is that we need to show the people that have the power to act at any level of government that we have exhausted every administrative remedy we have up and down the chain. We have been to EPA. We have tracked the science. We have proposed changes in how we regulate these things. And now we're sitting in front of you, county administrator or local elected official or state assembly person or we are sitting in front of you and saying, hey, the ball's in your court, because every level above you has not chosen to act, and you have the power to protect us.
Jay Feldman, Executive Director of Beyond Pesticides, based in Washington, D.C. You can learn more about Jay and his organization at beyondpesticides.org. That's going to do it for our show today. Special thanks to our friend and colleague, Jay Feldman, and to all of you who listen to and support this show. Patti and I'll be back next week with another edition of Green Street. Thanks for listening.